Okay, welcome back everybody. In this lesson we're going to develop the rules for derivatives of trigonometric functions and use them for a few examples at the end. Alright, we're going to start by developing the first two rules, the rule for the derivative of the sine of x and the rule for the derivative of the cosine of x. And we're going to do both of these using the limit of the difference quotient in order to derive the rule. So when we want to find the derivative of sine of x, that's going to be equal to the limit as h approaches 0 of f of x plus h, so sine of the quantity x plus h, minus f of x all over h. And in order to evaluate this difference quotient, I'm going to need to use a trigonometric identity to help me simplify. So the first thing I'm going to do is use that trigonometric identity. The sine of the quantity x plus h is equal to sine of x cosine of h plus cosine of x sine of h. We still have this minus sine of x on the end here. Alright, next I'm going to use limit properties, and I'm going to split this into two limits. A limit with the terms containing sine of x, so these two terms are going to be grouped together in one limit over h, and then everything else is going to be grouped together in the other limit over h. And so this turns into the limit as h goes to 0 of sine of x cosine of h minus sine of x all over h plus the limit as h goes to 0 of cosine of x sine of h all over h. Now I can factor a sine of x out of the numerator in the first limit here, and even more than that, since we're finding the limit as h goes to 0, that means that as h is changing, sine of x behaves like a constant term because x is not changing, x is not variable at this particular moment. Therefore, sine of x behaves like a constant, and so we can use the limit property and factor out the constant multiple sine of x. And that turns this first limit into sine of x times the limit as h goes to 0 of what's left behind, cosine of h minus 1 all over h. We can do the same thing with the cosine of x in the second limit. Since it's constant, we can factor it out of this limit, and that gives us the cosine of x times the limit as h goes to 0 of sine of h over h. Now this limit is one that we should recognize. Alright, we should know that that limit is equal to 1. The other limit is not one that we immediately recognize. I'm going to find it using my calculator, make a little table here. So I'm going to go into my y equals screen and put in, on my calculator I've got to use x as my variable in here. Cosine of x minus 1 all over x. And I'll set up a table to find that limit around 0. And we see as we approach 0, the values are getting closer and closer to 0 from both sides. And therefore this limit is 0. And so this becomes sine of x times 0 plus cosine of x times 1. And this just becomes cosine of x. And so our derivative rule is that the derivative of sine of x is equal to cosine of x. And so now anytime we need to take the derivative of the sine, we can apply that rule, that the derivative of the sine of x is cosine of x. Let's move on, and we'll derive the rule for cosine in a similar fashion. We're going to set up the limit of the difference quotient first. The derivative of cosine of x is equal to the limit as h goes to 0 of cosine of the quantity x plus h minus cosine of x all over h. And we'll use a trig identity to expand the cosine of the quantity x plus h. And hopefully you know these identities from pre-calc. This is cosine of x, cosine of h, minus sine of x, sine of h. We still have the minus cosine there. And we're going to do exactly what we did with the other derivative here. We're going to group the terms. The two terms containing cosine of x we're going to put into one limit, and the other term we're going to put into the other limit. So this becomes limit cosine of x, cosine of h, minus cosine of x all over h, minus the limit as h goes to 0 of sine of x, sine of h all over h. And now we're going to factor out the constants from both of these limits. So it's going to become cosine of x times the limit as h goes to 0 of cosine of h minus 1 all over h, minus sine of x times the limit as h goes to 0 of sine of h over h. And we found both of these limits in the last example. We found that this limit right here was 0. And we already knew that this limit right here was 1. So we're going to substitute those values in, and we get cosine of x times 0 minus sine of x times 1. And this is equal to negative sine of x. And so our rule that we're going to use from here to 4 is the derivative of cosine of x is equal to the opposite of the sine of x. All right, those are your first two derivative rules for trig functions, the derivative of sine of x and cosine of x. We're going to use these two rules in the next video to come up with the other rules for trigonometric functions, for the derivatives of the tangent and cotangent and secant and cosecant. But we'll do that in the next video. See you then. Have a great rest of your day.